coming from outside. So apologies for that.
Don't worry about that.
Just for that.
Okay, now actually we are ready to go. Let me introduce you. Maybe it's a good idea for me actually to introduce myself as well once again. Good day, everyone. Good afternoon from the Netherlands, and good morning, possibly in New York. My name is Zeki Erkin. I am associate professor in Delft University of Technology, and I am organizing this IEEE Signal Processing Society monthly webinars on behalf of Information Forensics and Security Technical Committee. And this is our sixth webinar, and we have a distinguished speaker this time, Paolo Gasti from New York Institute of Technology. And the topic is very interesting, biometric authentication, but with privacy protection. And I do believe the protocols are based on cryptographic constructions. Paolo, thank you very much for being here, first of all, for your time as well. Please introduce yourself and also tell us more about your research. The floor is yours. The webinar is until 5 o'clock, including questions. So we have sufficient amount of time. For now, I am going silent.
Thank you. So my name is Paolo Gasti. I'm an associate professor at the New York Institute of Technology here in Manhattan. As you will probably hear soon from the noise coming from the outside. I've been doing research on primarily applied cryptography, secure multi-party computation, and then applied to various areas. Earlier on to a future internet architecture and architecture that they were designed to replace the IP, but also to apply to biometrics, biometric authentication, biometric identification, and so forth. So what I would like to discuss today and to present today is a bit overview, a very high level overview of some of, first of all, biometrics, just to make sure that we all have shared the same vocabulary to have this discussion. And then a few ideas, specifically three ideas on how to operate on biometrics while being respectful of users' privacy and handling this very sensitive type of data carefully. I will briefly touch upon, I can just move to the second slide. I will briefly touch upon legal aspects and legal restrictions that are now out there, which is a good thing, but at the same time, significantly complicate handling this type of data. And I like to get questions as I move forward, not necessarily just at the end. So I'm going to keep an eye on the Q&A box. So feel free to ask there. If I miss your question, then there will be time at the end. And given that the time is tight, I'll just get started right away. So as I said, just a brief introduction about biometrics. So why biometrics? Probably these days, I don't have to convince anyone that biometrics are becoming more and more ubiquitous, both as a form of authentication, like when you unlock your phone or your computer, but also as a type of identification, right? There's plenty of systems out there that, for better or worse, capture biometrics live. Imagine cameras on the street and so on, Nest cameras, for instance, from Google, and then map them to who is this, someone from the household or is someone from outside the household. So for better or worse, this is something that is here to stay, and it's here to stay not only because of security considerations, but also in terms of user acceptance considerations. Nowadays, it would be odd to buy a phone that doesn't have biometric, and it would be, and definitely this type of features, functionalities are a distinguishing factor for several of the products that are out there. Again, Nest cameras, for example, but Wise and others are doing the same thing. I would like to focus this talk primarily on the security aspect of biometrics. So to that end, in principle, with biometrics, you can get better security and better privacy than password, right? Most people are not good at choosing passwords. So having someone like a biometric where you don't have to have any user choice in the flow definitely helps. Passwords are hard to remember, so you need to have recovery flows that become very often the weakest link within the authentication chain. And no one likes to type passwords, right? If you have used Face ID or Touch ID, you'd rather typically, if it's working as intended, you'd rather use that than type a long password. Maybe a PIN is still fine, given also the understanding the security limitation of that solution, but definitely you wouldn't want to type a 16-character password on your phone every time you unlock it. And another added bonus to biometrics and biometric system, of course, is that if you're like me, if you're unlocking your phone in the subway or in crowded places all the time, shoulder surfing is obviously something that is possible. Someone observing you as you type in your password is always something that can happen. The same is not true for biometrics. And I'll touch upon this point because I'm sure some of you are thinking about face and pictures being out there, and I'll touch upon that in a minute. Just to get the same vocabulary here, how does a biometric system look like actually? And as you can imagine, it's a complex system built from many different components. Right? On one hand, so at the very beginning, there is some sampling of the biometric data. So this will happen during the two major phases, which are enrollment, where the user sets up an account, sets up their biometric credential, and also during verification or authentication. And I'm going to use these two terms interchangeably, verification and authentication. So it's also during, again, the verification phase, where the user proves that it owns a certain identity. So the two flows are not too dissimilar, right? There is sampling of the biometric, there is some quality checking, right? We make sure if we're dealing with a fingerprint, we make sure that we can see the minutiae. If we're dealing with face, for instance, if we see with face, we make sure that we can see the face that is well lit, that is not blurred, right? That is not covered, that I'm not wearing a mask, for instance, and so on. That the image is sharp enough, etc. So, and this will happen in both phases. We will run at this point a feature extraction, and I'll talk more about this. The idea here is that we're rarely, if ever, going to use raw signals in order to perform authentication. Primarily, we'll be summarizing, we'll come up with a robust representation of these biometric traits, and this is usually referred to as feature. And again, I'll provide more detail on this in a minute. Once this is done, once we have this representation, this feature, we store them in a database and during enrollment. And later on, we'll pull them from the database to compare them with a fresh biometric sample that is used for authentication or for verification. So in this case, there will be a single sample pulled from the database because we're talking about authentication, and this single sample will be matched with the current sample. If we were talking about identification, it wouldn't be a single sample, it would be the entire database that is compared with the current sample, and then we can decide whether or not this face, this fingerprint, belongs to the system and which user it belongs to, or whether it does not belong to the system. So let's talk a little bit about feature extraction and robustness, right? If you think about any biometric and in particular face, you're going to be facing this problem, right? You have two samples, right? You have these two faces, and are they from the same person or not? And obviously, you cannot just compare pixels, right? These are two faces from Brad Pitt from a few years apart, but it's the same person. And probably none of the pixel values in these two picture matches, right? They're the same size, they're the same resolution, they're the same, everything is the same, but probably none of the pixel in the exact same place has the exact same value. Plus here you can see that Brad Pitt has aged, like all of us, over time, and therefore whatever comparison we do should also take that into account. This has a different hairstyle, slightly maybe different hair color, beard, no beard. Like there's natural variation. Light is different, pose is different. Right? You cannot overlap these two images and hope they will match because there's too many things that might have changed between these two images. So what you normally do instead is you run these inputs through some feature extraction algorithm, right? this feature extraction algorithm is designed to generate robust features. What it means is that this algorithm is designed to abstract away many of the variation that are expected to happen between images and generate some value, typically a list of floating point numbers or integers, depending on the system, that indicate that represent a compressed version of the original signal, right? Compressed and robust. So nowadays, most of these, in terms of commercial system, especially nowadays, most of these feature extraction algorithms are based on deep learning. So the idea here is to take very large data set, feed it into a machine learning system, and have it trained, for instance, in case of faces, to abstract away from details that change frequently for people, right? Hairstyle, beard, maybe even glasses, and so on. Once we train the system with different pictures with these characteristics, then the system will recognize that, hey, maybe sunglasses are not the feature that distinguish person A from person B. Maybe beard is not the thing that distinguish person A from person B. And we'll be able to therefore come up with features that are robust against all these changes. Pose is not the feature, lighting is not the feature that we should use to distinguish, right? And this thing will happen automatically. Of course, historically, features have been manually designed, and these features also were designed to take into account this natural variation between samples. So in short, what happens here is that we extract this short, compressed representation of the original data. We expect this representation to be fairly consistent, right? Given two different pictures from the same user, these values are roughly in the same range. But also we expect it to vary greatly if we feed it different pictures from different users. So instead of Brad Pitt, if I put my face there, very likely I will get different features, right? Now, one important, and this is of course needed so that later on I can just compare the feature to see if this is the same person or not. The one important thing to notice here is that even when I feed two different images from Brad Pitt, I will not get exactly the same features, right? This process is noisy. There's noise all the way throughout the pipeline, from the sensor to the actual original image, so the sampling itself, the sensors themselves, but also the original scene has changed, and that adds noise. And therefore, what we get in terms of feature is something in the same range, something that is close but not identical, which is why when we try to authenticate or even identify a user, we'll have to define some distance function that, taken two set of features, right, two feature vectors, will tell us, yes, these are close enough or not. And I would argue, and here, especially in this audience, some probably would be him to disagree with me, but I would argue that most of the complexity is in this phase, in the feature extraction phase, and to some extent, the distance computation can be fairly simple. There are plenty of systems that works on Euclidean distance, cosine similarity, Manhattan distance, and so on. So this probably is not where most of the meat is, but the real challenge here is to get these features that can be both robust for a user and very different for different users. I'm keeping an eye, just to stop for a second, keeping an eye on the Q&A box. I don't see anything yet, but if anything comes up, please feel free to ask. I'll try to address them as I go. I think it's more helpful that way, but there will be time at the end also for questions. So given what I've discussed so far, and given that this is primarily a security talk, one of the things to consider is how accurate a biometric system is, because how accurate the system is will also dictate, to some extent, how secure the system is, right? And when we talk about accuracy, we're typically talking about two types of error: false accept or false match, and false reject or false non-match. So the idea of a false accept, when you have a false accept, when two different samples from two different people are mistakenly treated as two samples from the same person, right? If you want to reuse what I just described so far, when the distance between these two samples from different people, from different subjects, is less than some threshold that we use to identify same or different. Okay, so in this case, this will have immediate security repercussions, an error of this type, because it means that an imposter can take can authenticate successfully as a legitimate user. So this is the first type of error. The second type of error is on false rejects. So how likely is it that two samples from the same user are classified as samples from different users, right? How likely is it that these two images from Brad Pitt are actually considered by the system different images? The corresponding feature vectors are farther than what we would expect from images from the same person. Right? And this has obviously usability issues, right? It might have happened to you that the Touch ID, for instance, doesn't authenticate you, right? It kicks you out, and that's very annoying. Or Face ID, right? Or any other biometric system. It's very annoying, and the first impact again is on usability, but also there is a meaningful impact on security for a few reasons. One is that if the false reject rate is too high, people will likely tend to disable the system and fall back to something that might be less secure. Think of 4-digit PIN, right? Not only that, you need to find a balance between false accept and false reject intuitively as you vary the threshold that indicates whether two samples are the same. This threshold right here, where you say two samples are from the same user or not. As you vary this threshold, you're gonna be in a different place between false accepts and false rejects. And as you vary this threshold, you're varying both security and usability of the system. So both need to be taken into account when designing and evaluating a biometric system. And different application will have different requirements in terms of what we consider acceptable as a false accept rate and what we consider acceptable as a false reject rate. Right? So whether the level of security of that application, whether it's identification versus verification, this will impact where we want to be in terms of these two types of error. Now, making sure that we're not mistaking one person for another, of course, is important in the biometric system, but it's not the only important factor, especially in terms of security. Another extremely important one is circumvention. So can I take a picture of Brad Pitt from the internet and unlock his phone or unlock his home, right, if he uses biometrics there? Can I circumvent the system? And the idea here is that nowadays we expect the biometric system to be robust against this type of attack, and this has many implications. So one is, as Denning is saying in this quote, the biometric system shouldn't be designed primarily under the assumption that the biometric being used is secret, right? Everybody knows my face in this call now, and whoever is not here can probably find it online. So that is not a secret. My fingerprints, we could argue whether it's a secret or not, but definitely many biometric traits are not a secret. And the security of a system that uses those traits should not be based primarily on the secrecy of this trait, but rather on the fact that whatever trait that is being analyzed now, it's a legitimate sample from a live person in front of the system, right? So this is the problem that is addressed by biometric liveness, or sometimes also called liveliness, or presentation attack detection, as is known in the industry. So different modalities will have different types of liveness mechanisms. So if you're looking at fingerprint readers, you can have some that are able to sample, to measure, to visualize blood flow under the skin. If you're looking at face recognition, there is a lot of literature on how to detect certain artifacts. Right? If I put, for instance, a phone screening from my camera, I will say some more effect there, right? Because the pixel on the screen and the pixel on the camera are not only at the same frequency, right? They don't have the same size. They're not going to be aligned, and therefore you see all these false colors and so on. And some systems are trained to detect those. Other systems rely on the fact that a real person is a 3D thing in front of the camera. So either the camera itself can sample 3D object, or the system will ask the user to perform some action that will disclose this 3D nature of the face, right? If you come closer or farther, the deformation, the 2D, the deformation of the projection of my face on the sensor will be different than the deformation that lack of deformation, if you will, that a flat image would have, right? So if I put a picture in front of the camera and I get it closer and farther, only primarily the size of the picture will change, but not the proportions between, for instance, if I do the same thing, the proportion between my eyes and my nose that are not at the same distance with respect to the camera, those will change on a 3D object and not on a 2D object. And some systems are trained to actually detect that. Here, the distinction between, for instance, detecting Moir effect and detecting these 3D components is the distinction between active, what is generally called active and passive liveness detection, where with passive liveness detection, a system is sampling the information that it has to detect whether the user is live or not, without asking the user to perform any action. With an active liveness detection system, the user is explicitly asked to perform some actions. So again, come closer to the screen or further, smile to show me that you're not a picture, blink, turn your head. All these fall under active liveness detection mechanisms, which typically tend to provide a stronger evidence that the user is live, but obviously they impact usability, right? Not only they're quite annoying to perform, but some users simply might not be able to perform some of these tasks. And an example here is where a certain user might have an issue. If the system is asking them to open their mouth and close it, some users might have an issue doing this. Plus, imagine doing this in the subway. That would probably look a little awkward. So acceptability might also be something that should be considered in this case. Okay, so just to summarize, in terms of security of a biometric system, we're concerned so far primarily with two aspects. One is, are these two samples from the same user? Can we reliably say that these two samples are or aren't from the same user? And can we ensure that the samples are from those are live samples, those are from a real person right now in front of a camera, right? Or in front of a fingerprint sensor and so on, right? So these are the two major issues that so far I've introduced. There's another important issue here, which is privacy, right? A few minutes ago, I said that we don't expect biometrics, we shouldn't expect biometrics to be secret. We shouldn't expect my face to be secret, for instance, or my fingerprint to some extent to be secret. But then at the same time, we are concerned with privacy. So what is that? What's going on here? So there are, I would argue, at least two reasons for that. So obviously, I don't have to convince anyone that biometric data represents sensitive information. And not only biometric data, but not only the raw data, right? Not only a picture of my face, but also features extracted from my face. These features are effectively a biometric, quote unquote, summary of the original data. Actually, they are the most meaningful part there. They are the most personal identifiable information component of the entire system. Right? Anonymizing these features is pretty meaningless, or pictures is pretty meaningless, just because I don't say who this picture or this feature belong to. I'm not really hiding much information. It's fairly simple to re-identify those, right? If I give you a picture, you can easily find who that picture belongs to. Entire systems designed to do this, with all the attached controversy, of course. So this pure anonymization, traditional anonymization is meaningless for this particular type of data. As a matter of fact, the data itself might be even more relevant from an identity point of view than the identity attached to it. So that's not something that makes sense. Not lack of privacy in terms of biometrics allow, among many things, tracking and de-anonymizing users, right? There is, imagine that you could authenticate using your biometrics to any website that where you have an account, and this website could store a copy of your biometrics. It would be trivial for this website to match which user is the same on each of them, right? You might have a different username, but it's trivial at this point to track your movements across the web, even more than it is today. And de-anonymizing, I mean, there've been plenty of very extreme cases of this. For instance, there was the OPM breach about 10 years ago at the Office of Personnel Management here in the United States, where biometric data from these users was leaked. The problem was that some of these users were covert operatives in foreign countries, and leaking that information means that whatever identity they have there, they can be trivially re-anonymized. So that was a big deal. And that's a prime example of the risk associated with someone storing a biometric data set. Okay, so again, biometric data is sensitive because it cannot effectively be anonymized, right, by just removing identifiers. It can be used to track, and it can be used to de-anonymize people in the real world, right? If you are a company storing a large biometric data set, your primary concern should be whether someone can come and exfiltrate that data. That will be a huge issue, clearly, in terms of protecting the data of your users. So privacy, I hope I convinced you at this point that privacy is a major issue. You don't want to have a honeypot with all these biometric data, because it can be used for so many uses that go against what the user would want. If that wasn't enough, there is plenty of regulations that support this around the world, right? In Europe and in the UK, there is GDPR. Right? In the US, we have CCPA in California, and it's pretty clear at this point that in the coming years, this will expand. In Asia, we have PDPA in Singapore, and soon probably other regulations. So this is something that, for very good reasons, biometric data, of course, this regulation covered things other than biometric data, but with respect to this conversation, biometric data is becoming and has become highly regulated in most jurisdictions, many important jurisdictions. Just to zoom in into one of these, so what GDPR and why it's relevant to this talk, what GDPR says about biometric data is that they are special category data, right? They should be treated differently from most of the other data. And what that means is that for instance, if you want to collect biometric data from the user, you must ask explicit consent. You need to keep track of it, right? You need to track that. If there's an audit, you can show that every record you have is associated with a user explicitly giving consent. Not only if you're collecting it, but also if you're processing it. You might not be the one who collected it, but if you're processing the same place or storing it, right? Any of these requires explicit consent. So the process itself is more complex. There's also a concept of proportionality within GDPR that says that you can use biometric data only if the application where you're using it justifies that their use, right? An employer, for instance, can ask employees to authenticate, to do their timesheets with their biometric feature, but only if there is a strong reason why no other technical measure would actually suffice there. Only if no other system that does not use biometric would actually solve the same problem. So proportionality is a big factor also in GDPR. So GDPR helps also in terms of flexibility to some extent, because it says that there are technical measures that can be applied to biometrics so that that data, once it's transformed, is no longer biometric data and doesn't fall under these strict provisions. It's very clear, though, to also say that a database of encrypted biometrics is not sufficient. If I take biometric samples and encrypt it under a key known to the database, that is not sufficient, because the database itself is able to both encrypt but also decrypt the data there. So that for the purpose of GDPR is equivalent to not having any protection, right? It helps to the extent of storing, because it reduces risk, but the data being stored, encrypted or not, is still biometric data under GDPR. So all these protections still exist. Interestingly, there has been an instance in which a company applied a one-way transformation to biometric data. Let's call it a biometric, some type of biometric hashing, right? Taking this biometric data, hashing it, and then storing it, so that given these hashes, it was impossible to go back to the original biometric data, there was actually a decision by a Greek court that states that transformation alone did not make the data non-biometrics. So any of the protection and consent required for biometric data was still needed, even though the data being stored was not biometric. It was impossible to remap this data back to the original biometric. And the reason for that, this sounds counterintuitive, but I think the reason is sound. And the reason for that is that the system could test whether a particular user is in the system given without their consent and just given their biometric sample. So let me explain that. So what it means is that whoever is running this system that applies this transformation could go on Facebook, take a picture of anyone, and see if this picture matches any of the user of the system, right? By doing this, the property that you achieve is linkability, right? You can link this, let's go quote unquote, anonymized hashed user accounts with a physical person. And because you can do the link, and again, by just taking the picture of this person, repeating the authentication flow and see if this person can authenticate as any of the user in the system. Now, this person doesn't even know that this is happening, right? I'm just taking their picture over the internet. And I can still link one of my accounts to that particular biometric data in that person. And therefore, the data stored in the database, even though it cannot mathematically be translated back in the original biometric data, that data is still biometric under GDPR. And I think this is very important. Now, we'll see in a minute that this approach is not the only approach feasible for protecting biometric data, and how GDPR actually gives us some opening to protect. So let's get straight into it. Okay. Just to get this out of the way, standard encryption doesn't really help here, because yes, of course, it can be used to protect data at rest, it can be used to protect data in transit, but we need to protect data throughout the entire biometric data throughout the entire process. So we need to protect data in use. We need to be able to perform authentication on data that we simply cannot see, right? If you apply a simple traditional hash function to biometric data, not only we have the problems that I just described in terms of unlinkability under GDPR, but also it doesn't really work on a technical side. If I hash a biometric vector, then even a small change in the vector once I get an authentication sample will result in a completely different hash. So in other words, if I'm given two different hash values, I can't tell whether the original vectors that were used to compute those were close or far. If the vectors were close, the hash would look different, completely different. If the vectors were far, the hashes would also look completely different. So there's no information there that I can use. This only works if the authentication sample and the template are identical, but this is extremely rare. This is not something that happens in a biometric system, which is why we compare distances between vectors rather than equality of these vectors. So none of this works. The security community has worked primarily on two different areas here. So on the cryptographic side, we have fuzzy commitment, fuzzy extractor, and secure multi-party computation, just to give three examples. On the non-cryptographic area, we have primarily one-way distance preserving function, for instance, cancelable biometrics. There are also other techniques, but this is the primary one. So what I'm going to discuss in the remaining time that I have is very brief overview of the cryptographic techniques that are out there, starting from fuzzy commitments. So here, this is I think quite a brilliant idea. That is, why don't we combine two tools? So one is cryptographic commitments, right? And for those that are not familiar, the idea here is that I have some secret S, I have some witness W that I use to seal this secret, right? So I can generate a commitment Y, indicated here as Y, that hides both the secret, but also the witness that I use to commit this secret, right? If I want to later on show, so I can give this Y to anyone, and later on I can prove that a certain secret existed when I generated S when I generated Y by disclosing the witness, right? So in other words, I can give you a copy of the commitment Y, and a year later, I can give you the witness, and the witness will disclose S. And there's no way that I come up with a different witness that discloses a different S a year later, right? I'm bound by this commitment to later on, or either I don't open it, or if I open, I must disclose S. Right? So this is the general idea. And again, an important property here is that if I give you the witness, if I give you Y, if I give you the commitment, you can tell how the witness looks like or how the secret looks like. How does this match with biometrics? Well, what if we use biometric data as a witness, right? What if we use we take some secret and we commit it under some biometric data, let's say a vector that represents my face. Later on, if I want to get access to this secret again, I will need to provide the same witness in a traditional commitment scheme. And the nice idea here of fuzzy commitment is, what if we can make this fuzzy, right? What if the witness doesn't have to be identical to the original one? As I was saying, the noise here. What if the witness doesn't, the second witness doesn't have to be identical to the first? What if you can just be close to it, and close enough still gives me the right secret, right? Too far gives me some random stuff, but close enough gives me the right secret. What if I can do this? And this is actually the idea there. And close, and the other really good idea, I think, is to use error correcting codes as the building block to, let's say, correct changes within the biometric, right? In this context, we see a change between today's biometric and the enrollment biometric that I collected a week ago as errors to some extent, as these differences are errors that an error correcting code could actually map back to the original data. I mean, I'm simplifying a little bit the construction, but this is the general idea. So if we combine error correcting codes with commitment scheme, with cryptographic commitment scheme, what we get is fuzzy commitments, where I can seal some secret with my biometric vector, and later on I can unseal that secret with a close enough biometric vector, right? My authentication sample. As you can imagine, you can use this for a variety of reasons, right? I can use this for authentication, where I can be challenged given a commitment Y to open it with my face and then use the secret to authenticate, right? I can use it for data access control to data, right? I can have encrypted data that can only be decrypted using this secret S. So every time I show my face, for instance, I decrypt my hard drive, I disclose a key that can allow my computer to decrypt the hard drive and boot, right? So these are all uses that are the fit with fuzzy commitments. And the idea here is that when instantiated properly, they can be used in the context of GDPR. The second idea, very briefly, is fuzzy extractors. So here is a different take on a similar problem. Instead of committing and decommitting something using my face, I'm going to use biometric or some biometric data. I'm going to use my biometric data as the source of entropy for some cryptographic key. Now, unfortunately, I cannot just use a biometric vector as a cryptographic key, because biometric vectors are not uniformly distributed and they're very noisy, as I've been saying. I won't, if I use a biometric vector to encrypt my hard drive, I will probably never be able to decrypt it, because every time I sample my fingerprint on my face, that vector is a little bit different. So if I just use it and there's a 1-bit difference between the sample that I use as a key to encrypt the disk and the one that I'm using to decrypt it, well, then I will get nothing. So what fuzzy extractors do is they add a cryptographic construction that allow us to transform this biometric data into uniformly distributed keys that also have the property that if the original data, that's why they're fuzzy extractors, because if the original data can be fuzzy, and if it varies slightly, this transformation can be robust enough to generate the same key every time. And this clearly can be used similarly to the previous object, where you you can use your biometric to generate a key to encrypt the disk, to uh, generate as a seed for a private key to sign some documents, or to sign a challenge for authentication, and so on. So any cryptographic application that requires a secret can be instantiated using fuzzy extractors, for instance. Now, of course, there is plenty that could be said about these two constructions and others. For instance, how much entropy is there in biometrics? Can I do offline attacks on this thing, and so on? These are all interesting questions, and again, this is something that I'm happy to expand on if there's any question related later. And finally, the last point that I wanted to touch upon is secure multi-party computation, specifically applied to biometrics, which is really my area. Here, I wanted to start with an example. So the famous millionaire's problem here is where we have two parties, Alice and Bob. They have large bank accounts, and they want to know who has the largest bank account of the two. Right? That's what I guess rich people do when they don't know what else, how else to spend their time. So there is an extra requirement here that they do not want to disclose how much money they own. So here what we have is two parties that have let's say they have two integers, and they want to compute the function that tells which of the two numbers is larger. They don't want to disclose anything else. They only want to know which of the two numbers is larger. Now, clearly, Alice cannot tell how much she has to Bob, because that would violate this requirement, and vice versa, right? They could find a third party to which they could disclose how much money they have, and this third party could reveal back how much money they have. But it might be unrealistic for them to find a third party they both trust. And what if this third party is breached, right? What if this third party accidentally disclosed the inputs that were given to this third party, or one of the two can bribe this party to disclose, right? There are plenty of issues why this third party simply might not exist in practice. And I hope you're starting to see where this is going with respect to biometric, but I'll clarify that in a minute. So the idea of multi-party computation is let's say the analogy here is, what if we can run computation within a box, right? We cannot touch it, we cannot see what's inside, but we can manipulate the inputs from Alice and Bob in such a way that no matter what the inputs were, at the end of this manipulation, we have the right result, right? You can look at this as, in a way, computing over encrypted data, right? Computation over encrypted data without having the ability to decrypt it. Right? Now, this particular problem, the millionaire's problem, has been solved by Yao a long time ago, and it turns out that the same solution actually is general. It can be used to compute any computable function, right? If you have a problem that can be expressed, or a solution to a problem that can be expressed as a program, then we know that you can run that program within the context of secure multi-party computation, and therefore find out what the solution to that problem is without disclosing the input to any of the party involved, right? Of course, each party will know their input and the output, from which they can learn something depending on what we're computing, but nothing more than that. And what it means for biometric is that in this case, you're going to have, let's say, your device, your phone, your laptop, sampling this sensitive biometric data. You're going to have some database in the cloud that is encrypted, but this time in such a way that the cloud cannot decrypt any of the data. And the comparison between this data will be done through MPC, through some secure multi-party computation protocol, where this data will be manipulated in the encrypted domain, and the result are these two vectors close in this case, these two biometric vectors close. So this result will be disclosed to all parties, but the parties will not learn anything else. For instance, this phone, which could be in the hand of an adversary, will not learn what the template looks like. And at the same time, the cloud will not know how the template looks like, but also how the authentication sample looks like. And yet, we'll be able to do the comparison. So, and this under GDPR is exactly what is needed in order to make biometric data into non-biometric data. So this encrypted biometric template in the cloud, because the cloud has no way to decrypt them, they're no longer biometric data under GDPR, and therefore can be treated differently from how biometric data would be treated. And even proportionality to some extent doesn't apply, because now this is no longer biometric data. So there can be systems that can be built to solve problem that with plain biometric data would not be feasible under GDPR because of proportionality, but by using a secure multi-party computation system, now that problem goes away. So this is the idea here. And this can be, without getting into detail, this can be instantiated in many ways. There's partially homomorphic encryption, fully homomorphic encryption, Yarrow-Galbo circuit, other type of circuits that can be used here. And there are plenty of systems with pros and cons that can be used here. And just to conclude, I know I'm a little bit long, but just to conclude here, I wanted to bring up some open problems and some state of where we are in open problems. So there have been obviously a lot of progress in recent year, both in terms of biometrics, but also in terms of systems that can be used to protect biometrics. Now, it's, again, as I was saying earlier, you cannot buy a phone that doesn't have biometrics. It's rare to find a laptop that doesn't have a biometric system. Soon it will be probably impossible. There are a lot of home devices that use biometric. There are a lot of door locks that use biometrics that you could go and buy today. So, and why? Because users like it. Users are accepting this more and more, and they're expecting this more and more. So we need to do something to make sure that we're doing this securely. There has been progress also with respect to protecting this data. There's a lot of research in the past 20 years on this in this very angle, and even commercial systems that actually use some of this research and some of these techniques that I discussed earlier to secure biometric data. So this is a positive development. Where I still see a big gap in the user's perception. And this goes in two directions. Sometimes users have the incorrect perception that their data hasn't been treated privately. So for instance, there are plenty of users that believe that data, if you use Face ID to authenticate to your bank app, the bank sees your biometrics, which we know is not the case, but it's a very hard thing to explain to someone that is not an expert in the field. So right now, this is definitely missing. But also the opposite is true. There are some cases in which biometric are sent online to whoever you're authenticating to. And in those cases, users don't have the opposite perception. That is, they often think that this data is not sent out of their device, or they don't fully understand the implications of that. So where we're really behind is in user education and user perception, which I guess is normal for a technology that is fairly recent in the grand scheme of things. But this is definitely something that moving forward to go to the next step needs to be addressed. And just to conclude on open problems, there is plenty here that if you're interested in working in this area, there's plenty here that can be done, from more accurate authentication system to new type of modalities. Right? I haven't talked about behavioral biometrics, which is an area that I've been working on quite a bit, where instead of using face or fingerprint, we use how the user interacts with the phone, with the device, phone or computer. Imagine if I'm using a keyboard, how I type. If I'm using a phone, how I swipe on the screen. So these are very active research areas in finding new modalities and understanding how well they work, what are the pros and cons. Designing new sensor, finding faster and more efficient secure multi-party computation algorithms, and so on. I didn't really discuss the details there, but as you can imagine, manipulating and encrypting data is going to be a lot more expensive than manipulate plain data. So how can I make it work on a phone? Can I make it work on an embedded device, right? If I don't have 8 cores, does this authenticate me within a second, or does it take now 15 minutes, right? So these are all open challenges that we have. Where we have right now, these and many, many more. So if you're interested in this area of research, there's plenty of work to do there. And with this, I will leave the last 10 minutes for questions.
Paolo, first of all, thank you very much for this very nice talk, and it is very informative. Actually, I was expecting more technical talk about cryptographic approaches based on the title, but to be honest, I learned a lot about also the underlying legal aspects as well. So thank you very much for that. I am looking at the audience. If they have any questions, you can raise your hand or write it down in the question and answer part of the Zoom. If not, yeah.
Thank you for raising that. And also I intentionally skipped some of the technical details given that I wanted to cover more ground. But if there's any technical question, just because it wasn't technical, it doesn't mean that the questions cannot be. So if you have any, if the audience has any question about any of the techniques that I mentioned, I'm very happy to get into the details there.
Great.
Plenty of backup slides.
That's really good. That's really good. Actually, I'm also doing a multi-party computation-based protocol designs, let's say, for different purposes. But the biometrics, it is very interesting. I have a question. This topic is hot for the last 2 decades or so, right? Mm-hmm. When I started this field, you were already well in advanced in this topic. And we have these super sensitive sensors, but mm-hmm. I also see that companies, even institutions, are developing this privacy sensitive sensors. For example, based on sonar or so, they can detect you are there as a human, but no details about face or your body shape and so on. So people are also developing hardware-based solutions. In which direction are we going? I mean, I had the impression that biometric authentication was mature enough in terms of signal processing and all these sensitive sensors. And I'm looking at your future research directions. So do you think that there are a lot more to be done in the next decade, or?
I guess it depends on who you ask. Since I'm now working on sensors, my answer would be aligned with what you just said. That is, we have really good sensors. I mean, anyone that is working on sensors and signal processing in the audience will definitely disagree with me. But we are at a place where that I would define it as good enough. We have really, really accurate system for a lot of the biometrics that are out there. Face is an example that I'm more familiar with, where you have a wide, especially with the advent of deep learning, a wide variety of systems that are extremely accurate and extremely robust to a lot of varying conditions, right? We have, I mean, everybody's probably familiar to some extent with Face ID and the hardware sensor that are highly specialized that are used to do liveness, but also illumination. I mean, you can authenticate with Face ID in pretty much complete darkness, which is not a small thing. I understand that people expect it, but it's not a small thing. So in a sense, I'm with you that in terms of sensors, in terms of signal processing, in terms of the neural network that extract these signals, we're in a really good place. Of course, these things can always be improved, but I would say that at this point there's diminishing return. We're starting to hit diminishing returns there. Where I think there is a lot to improve is of course, I'm biased here, but is in the area of securing this data, operating on encrypted data rather than plain data, operating on devices that might have been compromised. This is another thing that I didn't really talk about, but if you sample your biometric on your phone, can you really trust what is coming out of it? A liveness detection system running on your device, does it really tell you anything? Do you really need to run it on the cloud? Can you run liveness on encrypted data, right? Which is a very different problem than running comparison of encrypted templates. These are and does it even make sense depending on the type of compromise of the device, right? If I can replace the camera with a live stream, or with the stream that I recorded yesterday, liveness might actually be fooled. So all these are really, and there are actually directions to address these problems. So all these are really where I think we haven't hit yet a place where we are in as good as a place as with sensors and feature extraction and feature processing and matching. This is more of an open area. Again, I'm biased. This is the area where I'm working on, and someone working on sensor will disagree, but based on what I've seen, that would be my position.
Yeah, I really appreciate your view, and that's very clear. And meanwhile, we received 2 questions. If you take a look at them.
Yeah, I'm gonna go in the order in which they showed up. So please, among cryptography approaches, which one do you consider the best? There are more secure and privacy preserving oriented. Oh yeah, okay. This is a hot question. So which one I like? I can tell you my opinion, but not of course it's an opinion. I like secure multi-party computation. So I on the side of this academic activity, I started a small startup a couple of years ago, and I was actually asking myself the same question that you asked here. So if you were to, the startup acts on biometric data, biometric authentication with privacy. So if I were to, if I have to choose the best technique, which one do I choose? And based on a lot of research, what the choice was on some flavor of secure multi-party computation. The reason being the flexibility that that tool allows, right? You can, it's a Turing complete thing where you can write any program in the encrypted domain, which means that you don't have a limitation on, for instance, which matching algorithms you're going to run. If you're doing feature extraction in the encrypted domain, what you're going to run there, and so on. The real limitations are in terms of computational cost, right? You can run everything, but you don't necessarily want to run any algorithm, right? As I said, the cost of processing in the encrypted domain is significantly higher than running a simple program or a plain program, simple or not. So depending on the size and complexity on the program, converting into a secure multi-party computation protocol might be feasible or not. But if you're very careful with those choices, clearly, in my opinion, MPC is the more flexible choice, the one that allows you to not only experiment more, but also you know that down the line is very unlikely that you're going to hit a roadblock in terms of functionality. Something that, for instance, with fuzzy commitments, you're restricted by the type of error correcting code that you're using. You cannot use any arbitrary distance function, but only those that are allowed by the particular error correcting code. And granted, there are many options there. I mean, when I looked into it, if you're interested, you should look up Lee codes that are very flexible in terms of the type of error they correct, and they match really well with biometrics. It's almost an approximation of Manhattan distance between two code words. So that's very flexible. But at the same time, if I want to run cosine similarity, I probably can't, right? I don't know how to do it. Similarly for fuzzy extractors, are much more flexible than fuzzy commitments, but even then there are restrictions, and even then you have to be very careful about how you instantiate to be GDPR compliant, something that you don't have necessarily with MPC, right? Or it's much easier to achieve with secure multi-party computation. So my answer will be secure multi-party computation for sure, but then it really depends on the context. As a general tool, that's the tool that I would use, and that's the tool that I've used. In other contexts, there might be better uses for other tools. And moving, I know we only have 2 minutes, just moving super quickly to the next one. Is it necessary to explicit ask permission to manipulate user biometric data, even in the secure multi-party compliant framework? That's a great question. And that is primarily the reason, one of the main reasons why you want to go in that framework. Ask for permission, explicit consent, where the user has to say yes, they can't just read through. That's one very important blocker in a lot of scenarios, right? You will lose users because you're asking consent. And the nice part about secure multi-party computation is that if you're instantiated correctly, and there could be another 10-hour talk about that, but if you instantiate it correctly, it puts you in a position where you do not need to ask consent, and you do not need to treat the data that you're storing as biometric data, right? This encrypted state that you're storing is no longer biometric data. Of course, easier said than done. This is the destination, but the journey is extremely interesting. How to get there, how to design the protocol, how to prove from a legal point of view, which characteristic does this have to have to make this statement strong from a legal point of view. That's actually another talk, and I think an interesting one, at least for me.
Well, thank you very much, and it's perfectly on time. This talk is also recorded and available on YouTube SPS channel. Paolo, thank you very much once again for your talk. I really enjoyed it, and hopefully I will see you in person sometime soon.
Thank you. Yes, COVID allowing. Yes.
Dear all, we will not have a webinar on December because it's also holiday season. But we will come back again in January with a really nice invited talk and distinguished speaker. Until then, I wish you a very nice day and see you next time. Bye.
Likewise. It was nice